Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And I'm so happy to be back for another video because one of my favorite things to do on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians is to take a look at some of your work. Specifically, we're going to be doing another first page critique. And I think one of these days, maybe we could do a critique of something later in a novel, but I usually just stick with first page because, well, if you don't get the first page right, then that means a lot of things can be an issue. And it's easier, of course, because if I try to do a critique of somebody's climax, for example, we wouldn't have the context, right? We'd have to read the whole novel, so it wouldn't quite work. So yeah, we're sticking with first pages and sometimes prologues. We did a prologue one too. But I'm excited to get into this one. I haven't really read the text yet, but I just kind of set everything up. Natalia has, though. Natalia read I think a little bit of the entire excerpt that they sent, which was actually much longer than a first page, but I am going to be reading it fresh, of course. But I do have everything kind of set up, and I saw a little bit of like the title and a few like little details. So I'm excited. It looks like it could be a lot of fun. And so yeah, I just want to get into it. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's do it. All right, so I'm going to bring up our thing here now. Now, first, let's take a look at what they actually sent. And this is on the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. They sent this a couple days ago and no comments. So we're going to be able to help them out since they didn't get any comments from the Fantasy Writers community, which is a shame. But hopefully we're going to be helpful in place of that. So they have a story here called Beneath the Surface. And in brackets, they write, it is a crossworld/portal combined with magic realism fantasy. They used a question mark, so I guess that's them saying maybe they're not sure if this is the best way to describe what they're talking about here. And for those of you who are like, what are these terms? Portal fantasy is typically like an isekai, so think something like Chronicles of Narnia, or isekai, of course, is very famous in Japan. Japanese anime tends to do isekai, where you basically have somebody in our kind of modern setting. It doesn't have to be modern. It could be something like John Carter, for example, where you have a person who's in kind of like the real world, and then they go through a portal of some kind and they end up in a fantasy world. So Chronicles of Narnia, the kids, of course, during World War II, they get sent, or was it World War II? Yeah, because it was during the Blitz, the bombing of London. They get through the wardrobe itself and they get sent over to Narnia. That is a portal fantasy. Bridge to Terabithia, portal fantasy, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of what they're getting at here. And I guess they're saying that this is also kind of magic realism. That makes me think maybe this would be similar to like Pan's Labyrinth, where we have kind of like magic in our world too. So maybe it's not that they're going to a totally separate world, but like magic is kind of creeping into this one. So that's at least what this is kind of starting to get my head around. If you're curious what magic realism is, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but magic realism, it's kind of like a softer idea of fantasy where it's kind of similar to Harry Potter, but not really, where it's like our world, but magic happens to be in it. So it's not like we're in Lord of the Rings where magic is super normalized and that kind of thing. It's a very basic explanation. There's a lot of layers to this, but again, let's just get to the critique. So, Realistic Lover is the author here, and they wrote, hello, fellow fantasy lovers. I'm currently looking for critique on a few pages of what I have so far of the first chapter to one of the novels I am writing. Beneath the Surface is a YA story that follows Elena and her hairy companion Charlie on an adventure to escape Netherfall, a mysterious and foreboding realm that exists in the shadows between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Think Labyrinth meets Corpse Bride. So not quite Pan's Labyrinth, but I guess I wasn't too far off there. Along the way, she is met with trials, danger, and two brothers, Jekyll and Hyde types, who, under the control of the Reaper King, have been sent to stop her from leaving. Any feedback is welcome, but I'm more curious about my voice and how it comes through in my writing. I am new to writing first person, but I'm enjoying it and just want to see if the story is on track / seems intriguing. Obviously, little has happened so far as I'm setting up their entry to Netherfall, so I am more just interested in if my voice / prose tickles people's curiosity. This is my first draft, little editing. I just wanted to see if the direction I'm heading in is a good one. Thank you. Yeah, and for those of you who, just in case, if you aren't sure what YA is, that just means young adult. So I always want to try to remember sometimes the terms kind of fly around and not everybody knows all the terms. So hopefully I don't miss anything like that. But okay, so Beneath the Surface, I think that I've talked about this before where I always appreciate it when we do have like a little bit of a pitch that kind of comes before we look at the critique. I always prefer this because, as I've said before, it mirrors when you're actually in a bookstore and you go to the bookstore and you see the cover and you might read a little bit of the back and then you start getting into the first page. So it's very rare that we ever just kind of like read something and we don't know anything about it at all. Usually we at least get an idea of the aesthetic. We maybe get little hints of what's to come through some of the aesthetic details, right? So I always appreciate when folks give us a little bit of something. And I'm going to do my best, of course, to react to this without heavily leaning on what that they have shared in the pitch itself. We're just going to take a look now. Okay, so here is the thing. I don't know what to call it. The first page we're going to look at. And it looks like, yeah, we have more than a first page, but we're just going to kind of maybe do the first page here and then get a little bit into the second page since this first part here is already blocked off. So if you're watching the video, this will make sense. But for those of you just listening, I'll try to do this in a way that kind of helps you follow along. And so they start off with the title of the novel, Beneath the Surface. I don't love it. It's not a very catchy or hooky title. It's, it's kind of, how to say, it's like a little, like for fantasy, it's like a little simple and it doesn't quite get like the fantasy vibe to me very much, but that's okay. Titles are not that important when you're first drafting. I always just go, I just usually do a working title anyway, but that's just a reaction to the title in case the author is curious what I might think. And then they have their chapter 1. Okay. First line, and this is the most important line. Let's see how it goes. You see, I was never afraid of ghost stories. And if you were to ask my grandmother, she would refute that statement by saying, I was simply afraid of nothing. But she was wrong, because despite how confident we may present ourselves, we are all afraid of something. Ghosts just weren't my thing. In fact, I would even say I didn't believe in them. I mean, the idea of the living sticking around after death didn't make sense. And so, what I believed or hoped was that once you died, you vanished, simply ceased to exist. It was a view on death that many often ostracized me for. My grandmother blamed my father for the way I thought about such a thing, but I suppose it was just his way of coping, and when my mother died, it was like she never existed. I was 10 when she grew sick, 12 when she died. We didn't even have a funeral for her. One day she was here, sunken eyes and a weakened smile, until she wasn't. I was only allowed to keep one photo of her. My grandmother had kept it safe, while my father destroyed the rest, and I will always be thankful for that. Otherwise, I probably would have forgotten what she looked like. We could have almost been twins, if you removed what time and sickness had done to her. Our hair neither brown nor red, and our eyes a deep green, a color she once said reminded her of when sunlight touched the darkest part of the forest. It was an odd thing to think about. She had made us sound almost poetic, so I suppose it only made sense that when she died it felt like the finale to a tragic memoir. My life didn't get any better after that, and it seemed that whoever was in charge of my fate, if you believed in that sort of stuff, clearly found humor in my misfortune. Because shortly after my 16th birthday, my father was discovered on the bank of the Hollow Brook River. They said he had slipped, hit his head, and drowned, but I didn't believe them. He had been different since my mother's passing, distant. Even my grandmother said it was only a matter of time, which sounded rather depressing when you realized she was talking about the death of my father. Some would say it followed us. The way it felt etched into our bloodline was almost comical. And so, when I began to find comfort in a cemetery, perhaps to most, it just made sense. Okay, so I'm going to start off by saying there's a lot to really like here. I think that the main thing that they're asking about with their voice, I wouldn't say it's the strongest voice. I would say that it is a little bit, it's definitely a voice that reminds me of a lot of other voices. So it's not super unique, but it does have a lot of personality to it anyway. And it has me kind of curious if it's going to continue to flesh out a bit more. So it's a good start for sure. I think that this author, what they're doing right with the voice is that they are trying to balance a lot of the kind of like, I think this and I went through that. They are trying to balance it a little bit with, or they're not trying to go overboard with a lot of like the typical things you'll see in first person where maybe it's a little too indulgent with the first person voice. Sometimes I read stories and it's indulgent in the sense that I'm reading somebody's diary, basically. And in this case, I kind of am. And I think that that can be a turnoff for some readers. But I think that there's just enough here to get away from that kind of criticism. But let's get into some critique though, because I do think that there are some things here that could really be polished up. Now, and to be clear, I think that this is definitely a strong start. I definitely think the mood is kind of interesting, and I do think that the introspection here, the kind of brooding narrator stuff, there's something here, and I think that this could turn into something pretty good. So I'm going to definitely balance my criticisms in a way that makes it sound like, or it definitely comes across, I hope, as all right. I really think that this could be even better. And here are some things that I'm just seeing that you can take with a grain of salt. So I'd say with the first part of this, I think one of the first questions I typically ask when I edit other people's work and I review it and I'm kind of curious about what I think of it and what others will think about it is I ask a very simple question. Does the hook hook? Right? And hooks can come all over the first page, but you really want the first line to have a hook if you can. In many, many cases, the first line, the first paragraph really should have some kind of hook. It just needs to, because it's very easy for people to decide to stop reading. And I will say, I didn't mention this before already, but there wasn't a point in here where I would have stopped reading. The closest I came was the first line. Interestingly enough, I think the first line raised the most alarm bells for me. This first line here, you see, I was never afraid of ghost stories. I think that the reason it would make me stop reading is because of the construction and the flow of the sentence mainly, but also I think the sentiment isn't just immediately interesting to me. But here's what's good about it. Here's what's good about it. It is casual and conversational, yes, but I do think that UC comma is a little bit too casual, honestly. Like it kind of just has me thinking like UC, I see. What are you talking? This is the first line. It comes across like dialogue and out of context in this way. I just don't think that it really grabs me in the way that's intentional. And I think if you want to be casual and conversational, you really have to earn it a bit more. If the rest of the line was stronger, I think that UC would bother me a lot less. And I think what you're trying to do here is you're trying to set up something that should be a thematic contradiction, right? So the protagonist claiming that they aren't afraid of something is a classic setup to prove that they should have been afraid of something. That's at least my take on it. But instead of really building toward a moment like that where you can, as the author, kind of flip it on its head and hook us, we kind of just get this like long explanation in the first paragraph of why the protagonist doesn't believe in ghosts. And then there's like a tangent into the family trauma stuff. And you could connect this a lot better, honestly, because don't get me wrong, like I really do like a haunted backstory. I've been working on a couple of horror short stories and I've been having a lot of fun with it. But I do think that there's a reason, on this show, we talk a lot about in that first page, taking a page, of course, from Brandon Sanderson, how it's really important to really emphasize the promise of your premise right at the very beginning. And right now, we're kind of wafting through, I think, exposition that doesn't feel as compelling as it probably should be when it comes to being afraid of ghosts. Because when I think of like somebody who's not afraid of ghost stories, my mind can go to a bunch of different places, but nothing in here really has me kind of sticking with like one emotional hook to that. So, for example, what I think, instead of asking the question of like, why are they not afraid of ghosts? I think the question could be better if it was, what happened to cause that? I think a stronger hook might be, instead of just this pontificating by the narrator, that kind of like navel gazing and interiority that we're getting at the very beginning. I think if you started with a real scene here, a moment where there's some eerie tension, maybe a kind of question that somebody asks that gets left unanswered, maybe, or an image that we can have in our heads that really sticks, because there aren't a lot of images in this first page. You want imagery. You want me to be in the location, right? I don't even know necessarily like the time period. What you can do here, in other words, is instead of telling us that your main character isn't afraid of ghosts, we can see her in a situation where that belief is actually being tested. So then you have kind of this setup that I think you're going for. But then we are actually seeing the main character go through that tension and what they're believing being put up to the test of conflict and something that can propel the scene and give us a sense of who they are. So that would be my immediate response to that first line. I think it can really be tightened up in that sense. Okay, so then Another thing that I would maybe want to take a look at in more detail, just kind of like looking through this again, I think that we need to feel this protagonist a lot. I think that that's always the key to a really good first page. Am I there with that protagonist? And you mentioned that you're new to first person and you want feedback on voice. So let's actually dig a little bit deeper on that. Only kind of scratch the surface. I think that with this writing, the kind of thing that you're doing so far, I would say that it has a lot of melancholy. You're using some good moments of lyricism that I personally like for sure, and that is expected for what seems to me to be a gothic YA fantasy. So you're on the right track there. I think specifically like this line here about our hair neither brown nor red and our eyes deep green. I think I have that right. And so I think that in that line where it's like, oh, it's a color that reminds me when the sunlight touches the darkest part of the forest, that's definitely lovely. And it really, it paints a picture, and that's what you want. But I do think that your voice maybe kind of over explains some of these thoughts instead of trusting the reader to feel them. I do this all the time, which is why I'm pointing it out. I definitely run into this issue quite a bit where I definitely over explain. And I've had beta readers be like, okay, maybe pull the reins back a little bit, John. So that can definitely be, it's a good problem to have, right? Because it just means that you can maybe trim things. It's not necessarily that something's wrong with this structurally. And so looking at this line too, the line here, because despite how confident we may present ourselves, we are all afraid of something. And I think that you don't necessarily need to spell this out. I think that this is a case where the story could actually show us this truth instead of telling us this truth. I know show don't tell kind of, can roll off of people's backs a little bit of like, okay, yes, you can't show everything. Sometimes you just need to tell. But I think a good rule of thumb is that things that should be shown are these kinds of platitudes. Because if you just tell us, I get that it's first person, right? If you just tell us, it doesn't feel earned. It doesn't feel like the main character is, again, being tested on this idea, this thought. Rather, they're just kind of preaching it to us. And that's where the kind of diary mentality starts to come in a little bit too much, and where you can soften that. I think that there's this kind of self-awareness you seem to be going for, where there's the line, it was a view on death that many often ostracized me for. I think that ostracized is an example of a word that's maybe a little bit too formal for the tone you're going for. It's so conversational. When I read it, it kind of like, I was like, oh yeah. I think more importantly though than that, I'd say that like, who is ostracizing you, who or bullying you, whatever it is. I think you can show us a moment here where Elena is being judged for this belief instead of just reporting on it and kind of just telling us, directly like this. And I think if you sharpen her voice to be less explaining and more reveal-y, I guess. So what I mean is like, instead of explaining this stuff to us, it can feel like she is revealing this stuff to us. And then we can get something that's a bit more immersive. And I think that that's where using this content and framing it in a scene, that's usually why scenes work so much better than starting novels off with kind of these lengthy, here's where I'm at kind of things. I don't like it as much. I know that a lot of novels do this. And I think that a lot of literary novels tend to do this. Memoirs do this a lot. And I struggle with it. I read these things and I'm just like, I don't know where I am. I don't know. Like, we're kind of just like dancing around. We're going from place to place. And I like it. But this is a me thing. And I think a lot of people agree with me, but who knows? I just like to start off grounded in a scene. I know where I'm at. I know what's going on. And I know like where things are going, rather than me feeling like I'm in a cold open of a movie and it's just kind of like a vibe check sort of thing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah. And I think that another line that kind of stuck out to me, some would say it followed us. Again, this is another example where you could actually like show this kind of like streak of tragedy you're talking about through the way people react to this family. So you can use examples of like your neighbors avoiding eye contact, hushed whispers or social media stuff happening behind your back. Maybe in school, the classmates are kind of spreading rumors and gossip or giving you the side eye. And because if you just tell us that it's a pattern, we don't feel it. That's the truth behind show don't tell. It's not that telling is inherently wrong. It's just that telling is inherently lesser. It just doesn't bring the emotion as much. And that's why sometimes you can overly show. Sometimes it's too much if you just show, 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 show. Sometimes you do need to ground things and bring them back because you've thrown so much emotion at us that you don't need to show a certain moment, maybe. But in this case, I think there's a bit too much telling in that respect. So yeah, okay, what else? Again, I do want to emphasize this is good. This is good stuff, but of course, I'm doing my thing where I'm in editor mode. So obviously, I'm trying to poke whatever hole in it I can that is reasonable, of course, and not overly, critical and all of that. But let's talk about stakes and momentum. I think stakes and momentum are always really important when you look at the first page, and I think that sometimes people give feedback of like the stakes should be in the first paragraph. I try to get away from that a little bit. Sometimes no, you don't need to be like, and here's the inciting incident like right away. Some novels, yes, but I know that that's a trend. People want that like as soon as possible. But my thing is, you can slow the brakes a little bit. You can maybe get across or hint at these things early, but you don't necessarily need to just kind of like throw us right into the action right away. Sometimes that can be pretty off-putting, actually. But that said, we should always have a sense that we are moving forward in the story, if that makes sense. And so we get in this kind of first page here, we get a lot of setup, right? So we get told and explained a lot about a lot of death, family loss. There's a bit of fatalism in this first page, but I don't get a sense of what's happening in the present, right? All I kind of know here is what's happened before. And I think, in my opinion, the best opening pages, even ones that do set up like these tragic backstories, right? They do still tend to have, hopefully, a lot of present action, something that's happening in the now that's going to make us really lean in. And I guess, yeah, at the moment, we're kind of swimming through backstory here without a clear now moment. And so I think a good opening in general, I agree with Sanderson actually on this because he talks about it. Sanderson talks about how you want your opening to have like a good opening should have like a promise, as we've said, and a good question. Will this character do this? So the beginning of Star Wars, will the droids be able to get the Death Star plans and avoid the Empire? And right now, what we're getting from this kind of story is like our protagonist feels very fatalistic, but we don't see her challenged by anything yet, just kind of ruminating in the things that have already challenged her before. And so even if the whole Netherfall thing is coming soon, like we know from the pitch, by the way, I love that name, Netherfall. It's really cool. In fact, I feel like that should be in your title. Me personally, I think it's really cool, and so it'd be cool if your title had it in it. Just saying. But yeah, so even if it's going to be coming pretty soon, like even in this first chapter, maybe the second, we do need some of the tension here, some of that immediate tension that's going to properly set up this world that we're going to be in, so it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere. Even Portal fantasies, specifically fantasies like an anime and all of that, the ones that kind of just all of a sudden it's a high school kid and next thing you know they're in Game of Thrones. Even those stories typically set up the tension of the drama and the conflict in these fantasy settings by showing us a little bit of the real world, or they just jump us in really quickly, and that's usually not very good. And I don't know, that is part of the reason why a lot of Japanese portal fantasy is regarded as very popcorn and not very literary. And I think the standards typically are a little bit higher for things like novels, light novels even, so the Japanese version of this in novel format as opposed to the anime format. But anyway, I don't want to get off that tangent. You know how I tend to do that. But anyway, so what I'm kind of leading this toward is you could take your main character, for example, and instead of just kind of having her talk to us in this void, you could place her in a place. You could put her in a cemetery, right? Talking to her father's grave. Maybe she's in a situation where she just saw something really scary. Maybe she sees something that maybe challenges her non-belief in ghosts, but she's of course rationalizing it. And that's going to set up this idea that maybe something supernatural that is more visceral and in the moment is going to happen later. But the stakes of that can be small and quick, and I think a little bit more of a better setup, I guess, in that case, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I think that about covers it. I don't have too much else to say here. I like how you said little editing. There weren't, crazy grammar issues or anything like that. Of course, I think that we are, engaging with somebody who is an experienced writer. Yeah, I can definitely tell that you've been doing this for a while. But just to kind of sum it up, I guess 3 main things. keep working on that hook to be a little bit stronger. Maybe start in a moment instead of a general reflection for the main character. That's number one. In terms of the voice, I would say maybe trim the explanations, make the voice a bit tighter, and be sure to trust the reader to pick up on the mood that you're going for and the themes, of course, through action and through things that you can show to us and reveal to us rather than explain to us. And lastly, making the tension a little bit more present, putting things in the now, what's happening at this moment that's going to propel your main character towards some kind of journey. Yeah, I think that's the good stuff. I think this is a solid aesthetic. I think it's leaning into that dark gothic mood that I can tell you want to write. And so I'm getting wrapped up in it too, which is great. And I do think that on top of that, though, you can just keep working on the narrative spine of this mood to just make it feel a little bit more resolute so that as if I was keeping, I can't talk. So when I'm still reading and going through these pages, you can get us to the good stuff even further, right? I think that if you just do a few tweaks to this page, I don't think it's huge. It's just trimming down the exposition, maybe just a little bit of framing of the where we are and in the now, and then maybe sharpen the voice here and there. You can make this really immersive and active. And I think this could be a really killer opening. I'm really happy to read this. And I would say to everybody listening that one thing this person is doing well or is on the track to doing even better, I would say, is that they understand. And I think hopefully you can understand that your first page shouldn't be about the information you are sharing with the reader. It should be an invitation. I should feel invited into this world. I am getting that, right? I think despite all the things that could be polished and kind of messed with here, I do feel like the author is inviting me into this world, and that's what they have a knack for. And that for sure is something that you can apply to your own work as well. And so there's a lot of different ways to do it, of course. But hopefully this has been a helpful kind of little critique for the author here. I think it's really cool that they were able to, share this workout and experiment with first person. I think it can be kind of scary to go from maybe if they were doing third person, of course, to doing first person. I went through a transition like that where I started to write a bit more first person for the first time. And it can feel a little bit like, can I do that? Am I really that kind of author? Like, is that my thing? And I think what I discovered when I made kind of that switch is that I think that switching that kind of structure for yourself and a writer, A, it is challenging, but B, you are helping yourself become more well-rounded. There are things you can do in first person you can't do in third and vice versa, of course. But I think what's helpful about first person is that a lot of readers like it, especially for YA. There are key reasons for why they like it. We could do a whole video about it. I think that another nice thing about it is that it does kind of help you bring that voice out to the forefront a little bit easier and in a way that keeps your word count tight. Right. So you can definitely, in a first person story, you can really tighten up the prose so it's not quite as long, unless you really go overboard on the interiority, which guilty as charged. But anyway, that's going to do it for today's episode of Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Hope to have some more stuff coming soon. We do have some listener questions we're going to be getting to. We do have a bunch of things actually in general. I've been loving, of course, all the comments we've been getting on the YouTube channel. So please keep it up. We love to see it. And that's going to do it for us today. So see you on the next one.